I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today we're going to try to answer the question, is logic mind-dependent, and is logic universal? Is logic something human beings invented, or is it universal? The first half of the essay tackles where logic could have come from. Some possible commonly cited candidates are our brain structure, God, science, or our culture. But before we examine each of these potential candidates, we need to understand what logic is. The material from the first part of this essay is primarily drawn from Michael Shenefelt and Heidi White's book, If A Then B, How the World Discovered Logic, which was published in 2013. The second part of the essay tackles the universality of logic, where I draw from an influential 1992 article by James Conant entitled The Search for Logically Alien Thought, Descartes, Kant, Frege, and the Tractatus. So, what is logic? Logic is the study of the structure of argumentation. Argumentation is simply the way we argue. The term argument used here is not in the sense of quarreling, but in a way it is. An argument is how we reason about things, to show how what we are arguing about makes sense. More formally, it is how we attempt to prove what we are proposing, the way we reason about it. Logic figures out what the patterns common to valid arguments are. A valid argument is when, if the premises of our argument are true, will lead us also to a true conclusion. If the premises are not true, the argument is still valid, meaning the form is right, though false premises cannot lead to true conclusions in a valid argument. If the premises are true, then what we have with a valid argument is a sound argument, where the true premises lead us to a true conclusion. Notice that we talked about patterns. The content of the statements and arguments are not what is under investigation in the study of logic. In fact, we do not need to know what the contents of the arguments are. What logic is concerned with is the form or the structure of the arguments. We could replace the content, the subjects and its predicates, of the argument's propositions with symbols for the variables, and if they have the right pattern or structure, the arguments will be valid, whatever the content happened to be. So, did mankind invent logic? Thanks to evolution, our brains are structured to be useful to us. What is useful is what solves our problems, such as the need for food, shelter, and water. To solve these problems, we need to be able to reason correctly, and to reason correctly is to reason logically. Consider if a person has a different brain structure that caused them to reason differently and incorrectly. They would be unable to solve the problems they encounter in the world, such as how to find food, shelter, and water, and they may endanger themselves if they do not make the right connections between things, if they are unable to reason correctly about things. For example, if one saw a tiger in the wild, one should run away. If that is correct reasoning, then if a person has a brain structure that did not tell them to escape under such circumstances, they would be in trouble. Such people would have perished, with their genes more likely wiped from the gene pool compared to those who had a brain structure that allowed them to reason correctly. The latter group will have survived longer, which will then give them more opportunity to pass down their genes, which will lead their descendants to have a brain structure that is able to reason correctly. What does it mean to reason correctly? It is to be able to draw the right conclusions from premises. It is to know that Premise 1. If you see a tiger in the wild, you are exposed to a threat. Premise 2. The proper response to a threat is to run away. See a tiger in the wild? Conclusion. You saw a tiger in the wild and respond to this threat by running away. What logic does is to capture the form of valid methods or ways of reasoning that we seem to possess innately. No one had to teach the caveman the above argument of how to react to a tiger. He certainly did not go to school and attend a logic class, since such a class must await Aristotle in the 4th century BC to formulate the rules of logic. The brain had evolved in useful ways, and being able to reason correctly, that is, logically, is one of these useful ways. Being able to reason correctly is to have the ability to recognize logical patterns that leads one to the right conclusions. These patterns aren't valid because our brains happen to prefer them. Instead, our brains prefer these patterns because these patterns are already valid, explains Shenefelt and White. How people are able to reason correctly is not that their brains created the logic out there in the world. It is logic which is already in the world which shaped the brain so that it can reason correctly. It is not our brain which decided what is logical, but it is logic that decides how our brain should be structured. To recap, our brains evolved the way it did because it helped us do useful things and logic helps us do useful things. So is logic the way it is because it is useful? No, because that is getting things backwards, metaphorically putting the cart before the horse. Logical patterns aren't valid owing to their usefulness. Instead, their usefulness is owing to their validity, writes Shenefelt and White. Whatever tricks of reasoning our ancestors devised to endure in a difficult world, the tricks were useful because they were logically correct, not correct because they were useful. Could our sense of logic have come from God? Is some argument logical because God made it so? While not everyone believes in God, this angle is still interesting even for atheists, because if God had to make logic, then it seems to suggest that God is irrational, where his decisions are not guided by reason but are merely arbitrary, a kind of blind power that is not objectively rational. And if indeed that is the case, then there is no need to further explore the nature and origin of logic, since it ultimately comes from some force which we cannot hope to understand. Shenefelt and White writes, the divine command theory of logic seems to force us to abandon the notion of a just and reasonable God and replace it with the idea of a merely powerful, even capricious one. Medieval philosophers believed that logic was the common tool of all the sciences, but we can extend that to all fields of inquiry, including the sciences, the social sciences, and even the humanities. This is because all analysis, explanations, understandings, methods, procedures, science, and rules must take some notion of logic for granted, writes Shenefelt and White. Logic is not just used in science. Even a work of fiction must express its story logically to be understood by its readers. Logic is not an outcome of any field of inquiry, such as physics, neurology, theology, sociology, or linguistics, because these fields depend on logic for us to understand them at all. Logic cannot be a consequence of anything else, because logic defines what counts as a consequence. How about culture? Do different cultures have different logics? When people make such a claim, do they simply mean that other cultures have different beliefs? Recall at the start, I had talked about how logic is not concerned with the content of arguments, but with its form. Logicians study how beliefs are connected, how one belief may lead to another or follow from another, where they are concerned with the pattern of these inferences and not its contents. Consider if there was really nothing in common between two cultures, no common logic between them. How would it be possible for them to even understand each other? If there was no underlying system of inference common or at least overlapping to some extent to both, they would have no way to make sense of anything the other is saying, even if they knew the words of each other's language. However, we are able to understand different cultures, which means that they do have overlapping if not similar logical systems of inference. Yet, why do different cultures have different beliefs if they have the same or overlapping system of logic? It is because they have different premises, which logically lead them to different conclusions through the same system of logic. What we have done so far is to show that logic does not come from our brain, God, science, or culture, but we have not shown where it comes from. Neither have we proved that logic is universal and unvarying. This is because of a difficulty which arises when we use reasoning to reason about reasoning itself. The very act of reasoning already employs logic. To speak of proof already presumes a logical structure from which we derive a proof. We will be trying to justify logic logically, which will cause us to argue in a circle, presuming what we instead have to prove. What does this mean for proving logic? There will necessarily be some propositions that cannot be proved simply because they are the basis of which proofs come from. Referring to one of the two most basic principles in logic, the principle of non-contradiction, the other being the principle of identity, Aristotle writes, For it is impossible that there should be demonstration of absolutely everything. There would be an infinite regress, so there would still be no demonstration. The evidence for these fundamental principles have to come from themselves. They have to be self-evident, since no further proof is possible. Logic seems timeless, placeless, and mind-independent. They seem to be true, period. Or are they? What we do know is that logic is the frame for how we understand things, the structure of how we reason. But could there possibly be a different alternative logic, a non-human alien logic that is incommensurate with our logic? If so, what would it look like? Let us for a moment imagine that this indeed is possible. Here I draw from an influential article by James Conant entitled The Search for Logically Alien Thought, but I will not rehearse his thesis. Instead, let's just say I'm influenced and inspired by it. Since logic is the way we can even comprehend anything, if we encounter an object, a being that uses a different logic, we will not recognize that what that being is doing is reasoning, that that being is a thinking being. If there is no common basis whatsoever, no overlaps between our two modes of reasoning, we will not even be able to recognize the other mode as logic at all. Consider that we meet an alien. We will recognize some things when we encounter them. We will see that we are indeed looking at something. We may hear it utter sounds maybe, if sound is its primary mode of communication. If it isn't, then we may see it acting in other ways, not uttering sounds but something else, perhaps moving its limbs if it had any. But we're not going to be able to make any sense of its attempt at communication. We will be unable to decipher what it is telling us. Perhaps one way to understand this is to imagine if an object, living or non-living, that we know on this planet is actually conscious, sentient, and capable of communication. Let's use, for instance, something we consider as non-living, like a brick. Say that brick is having thoughts and is in some way putting these thoughts into the world. Because it has a different logic, we will be completely and utterly unable to understand its thoughts. In effect, we will not even recognize that it is a thinking being at all. I know it may seem far-fetched to talk about non-living inanimate objects as objects that can think. We know it can certainly move, since a brick can fall from a higher place or be thrown across a room, but we likely will not mistake such a movement as indicating that it is trying to communicate thoughts. Now imagine a cherry tree waving its branches about as the wind propels them. Could it be that this waving is actually a language which it is using to communicate with? If it is, either we have yet to decipher what it is saying by trying to interpret its motions using our logic to make sense of what it is saying, or more to my point, because we do not possess a common logic, we do not in effect recognize what it is doing as communicating at all, that it is a thinking thing that has thoughts and are now communicating its thoughts. It may respond to stimuli. It can move on its own, for instance towards light and water. It can carry out biological functions such as reproduction, feeding, and produce waste. But does it think? Even if it does, because we do not possess a common or somewhat overlapping logic, we will not be able to recognize that it is thinking. Because we have a logic, a structure that governs how we think, if we encounter beings that have a different logic, we will not be able to recognize it as thinking. And hence what we will consider about such a being is that it is not a thinking being. Quite naturally, the same way we consider a brick a non-living object as non-thinking. We have no way of making any sense of what it is communicating, and so we do not even realize it is communicating. How about with aliens? Will it not be the same situation? Either we have a common logic or at least have some overlaps in our logical systems by which we can then possibly recognize that the other is communicating with us, or we do not, and hence even if they are indeed trying to communicate, we will not be able to recognize it and will think that they are non-thinking beings. On the other hand, there are non-living objects that communicate with us in ways we can completely understand because their speech is logical. Examples include computational devices such as mobile phones, most obviously manifested in their voice-activated virtual assistants like Apple's Siri or Amazon's Alexa, or artificial intelligence systems such as ChatGPT, which is the current rage. But if we define an object that is able to process and output information logically as thinking, then many non-living things are thinking, including robots with voice capabilities, but also the simple handheld pocket calculator, and even appliances like coffee machines and washing machines, who can tell us based on its logical programming that the coffee is ready or how much detergent to add. Yet we do not consider such objects as conscious, at least not at their current level of computational ability. Being logical does not qualify a being as conscious, but as we postulated above, there could possibly exist conscious beings like an alien, but whom we do not recognize as thinking because it thinks in a different logic. Hence there is a distinction between consciousness and thinking, which need not correspond to the distinctions between living and non-living objects. Non-living objects, such as calculators, are logical, while living objects may possibly be non-logical. If logical is what thought looks like from our human perspective, then we come to a rather odd conclusion. Non-living objects such as calculators are thinking, while living objects may possibly be non-thinking. The latter part of that statement is in a way not entirely surprising, since we do not regard many living objects such as cells, plants, and lower-level animals such as sea anemones as thinking. They have the ability to move autonomously, carry out biological acts such as growth and reproduction, and respond to external stimuli, but are unable to communicate with human beings. But are higher level animals like rats, cats, dogs, giraffes, elephants, chimpanzees, whales, and dolphins thinking? We may say they are, because they demonstrate reasoning abilities such as being able to navigate out of a maze, but also two-way communication with human beings. But does an inability to communicate indicate non-thinking, non-intelligence, or could it be that they have a different logic from the set of human logical systems? To us, whether there exists different logics from the set of human logics is logic universal? It seems that we cannot, even in principle, know the answer to this. Why? Not because we simply are not yet smart enough to know, or that we await some discoveries so that we can know, but because if another species does have a completely different logic, we will not be able to recognize it. We will not recognize whatever it is thinking as thought. We might see that it is doing something, but we will not be able to make any sense of it whatsoever. It will quite literally be nonsense, not in the sense that they would be saying something false, but in the sense that what they are saying makes no sense to us. We cannot even tell if what is said is true or false because we are simply unable to make sense of it. If we have any hope at all of communicating with aliens, their logic must somewhat overlap with ours, if not be simply the same system, at least fundamentally. Otherwise, there is no possibility we can make sense of what they are trying to tell us. Thank you.